One of the benefits of the type of content that I do is that you never have to worry about me taking stuff out of context. That's, I think, pretty specific to the streamed format, because everything you see, I see. I'm seeing it there live. Whatever context you're getting, I'm getting too. I usually watch a whole video from start to finish, skipping ad segments and what have you, title cards. And for that reason, it is essentially impossible for me to make shit up about what my opponent is saying. I can't take them out of context. I can't strawman them because they're right there. I'm directly responding. Unfortunately, this extremely popular episode of Sam Harris's podcast, Making Sense with Sam Harris, nearly 600,000 views, is nearly 2 hours long. That is a very, very long segment. It's a podcast. I can't respond to the entirety of this video. It's not possible. But I know that this segment contains stuff that I would disagree with severely. I had somebody email me, and they provided me a timestamp they suggested I begin watching from. It's entirely possible I will be missing out on some context here. And because it is possible that I'm going to miss out on some context, I'm going to make an effort to be as charitable as possible to the arguments that I hear, even though I generally have a very low opinion of Sam Harris, because I don't want to run the risk of assuming things that he has made caveats for beforehand. Let's begin.
Right, we're talking about career criminals who are usually armed and in many cases trying to kill the cops. Those aren't the cases we're worried about. We're worried about the unjustified homicides. Now, some people will think these numbers still represent an outrageous injustice.
So we're opening up by talking about black deaths at the hands of police. Now, it is true there are shootouts with cops committed by black men. And I would make the argument that while anyone who opened fires on a cop probably has license to be killed, I think that's reasonable to say. I wouldn't blame a cop for firing back. I also believe the fact that there is so much conflict in these communities speaks to certain forms of discrimination in and of itself.
After all, African Americans are only 13% of the population. So at most, they should be 13% of the victims of police violence, not 25%. And any departure from the baseline population must be due to racism. Okay, well, that sounds plausible, but consider a few more facts.
Well, it's reductive right there. So I know what Sam Harris is about to say, and this is why I don't pre-watch these things live, because I can't do my Joseph Joestar, I know what you're about to say bullshit if I actually do know what they're about to say. And the response that I'm about to make preemptively is this. It is true that there are a bunch of correlating factors that go into the oppression of black people, i.e., if you control for socioeconomic circumstance, so on and so forth. The issue is, as with every other disparity in our society, there are only two potential causes: environment or genetics. If you want to make the genetics argument that black people are just predisposed towards committing crime inherently, I invite you to present me data on that subject. I know for a fact that there is none. But if you agree there are environmental causes, then it is very easy to trace those environmental causes back to things which linger from obvious and deliberate on-the-books racism, not even to speak of the implicit racism in our society today.
Facts. Blacks are 13% of the population, but they commit at least 50% of the murders and other violent crimes.
This is not true. Black people do commit about 50% of the murders in this country, but not other violent crimes. For other violent crimes, the number is quite a bit lower, and even that only refers to arrests, not to incarcerations. Just to feel a need to clarify.
Now, if you have 13% of the population responsible for 50% of the murders, and in some cities committing 2/3 of all violent crime, what percent of police attention should it attract? I honestly don't know.
Well, against which communities? Not all black communities are the communities that commit a ton of crime. Most of the black murder rate in this country is done in very specific communities where gangs that are mostly made up of black people fight other gangs, mostly made up of black people, for control over territory so they have turf upon which to sell their drugs. But let me ask you this. Let's imagine that we have, we don't need to imagine. The Italians, when they came into this country, the Italians brought crime with them. That's a fact. But a lot of the crime that Italians brought with them came from a very specific subset of the population that worked within organized crime. So if you have a group of 1 million people, an ethnic minority in America, and of them, about 1,000 of them are a well-connected criminal syndicate that commits a massively disproportionate amount of crime, do you think it would be fair to justify unfair treatment against the entire ethnic group based on the behavior of that one syndicate? I would argue no. I would argue that it's a non-racialized element, frankly. And the reason why there are so many black gangs is because they were the ones forced into the ghettos where the only opportunity for economic success was drug running, and because the government in large part allowed the formation of drug cultures to run rampant in these communities before enacting the war on drugs and making it so severe a criminal offense, thus creating the perfect conditions for gang warfare. Is that a race thing? I mean, did race make that happen? Well, kind of, because black people were the ones who were redlined into those districts. But is that their fault? In another world, where it was instead the humble Irish who were cracked down on and shoved and redlined into these ghettos, they were the ones disproportionately policed, they were the ones forced into these inner cities, they were the ones who were given access to these cartel drug runs, they would be the ones making up such a disproportionate amount of the murder rate in this country. Guaranteed. The humble Irish. It's true.
But I'm pretty sure it's not just 13%. And given that the overwhelming majority of their victims are black, I'm pretty sure that most black people wouldn't set the dial at 13% either. And here we arrive somewhere near the core of the problem. The story of crime in America is overwhelmingly the story of black-on-black crime.
I mean, not really. If we're talking about low-level murder, today and only today, then yeah, in large part. If we're talking about historically, that is not the case at all. And even today, if we're taking a look at like crime that meaningfully affects our society, how many people died due to murder in 2018? How many people died due to an opioid overdose based on the irresponsible pushing of prescription drugs by doctors who are funded by our pharmaceutical industry? Opioid. My issue is, when we talk about crime rates, we're usually only talking about population over severity. Which is worse? The crime that happens today in America, the black crime rate, or the handful of lies it took for the United States to get embroiled in a war in Iraq? Which one of those shows up in the crime statistics? Which one of those do people talk about when they talk about harm done? We pay a lot of attention to low-level crime and the harm it does. But when we reduce discussions of criminality exclusively to those areas, we ignore that the greatest harms done to our society are usually done by people who never spend a day in a jail cell. And that is a fundamentally classist way of looking at crime, and it is a fundamentally racist way of looking at crime, because it implicitly gives credence to the most powerful in our society while continuing to trample on those who have next to no power, who have very little power, in fact. But, I see.
It is also, in part, a story of black on white crime. But for more than a generation,
That's not really that common statistically.
it really has not been much of a story of white on black crime. Now,
I mean, that depends. Do you consider redlining to be a white on black crime? Do you consider police brutality to be a white on black crime? Do you consider the disproportionate arrest rate to be white on black crime? Do you consider the disproportionate rate of sentencing to be white on black crime? Do you consider the implicit bias in the criminal justice system to be white on black crime? This is exactly what I mean. The way our legal structure is set up right now is optimized to leave the greatest berth for condemnation possible with regards to the shit black people do. And then all the stuff done against black people systemically, that gets rolled into the legitimate functionality of the system. When them North Carolina legislators pass a bill that was struck down by the Supreme Court as being racist against black people with surgical precision, people go, oh, whatever. Okay, whatever. Maybe it was racist, maybe it wasn't. Just would have disenfranchised tens, hundreds of thousands of voters. Just whatever. Kept them from voicing their political opinions. Literally the thing we fought a revolutionary war over. But then you get some disproportionate rates of crime because in inner city environments, gangs are killing each other, and the police are doing everything criminologists and sociologists have been telling them not to do for 40 years. And people throw their hands up. Now, Sam Harris, for the most part so far, from this one very small segment of the podcast that I'm listening to, seems to be leading a lot with the questions that he is asking. He has brought up no sociological explanation. He's not really considered why these things may be. And I cannot help but remember the fact that Sam Harris has had Charles Murray, the hack author of The Bell Curve, who didn't even know what heritability was, onto his show before. So I am a little curious what his perceived explanation is. And I guess I'll give him a chance. Ah, yes, he defended Charles Murray as well. He didn't just have him on. He defended Charles Murray and The Bell Curve, if I remember correctly.
the murder rate has come down steadily since the 1990s, with only minor upticks. But nationwide, blacks are 6 times more likely to get murdered than whites. And in some cities, their risk is double that. And around 95% of these murders are committed by members of the African American community. The weekend these protests and riots were kicking off nationwide, when our entire country seemed to be tearing itself apart over a perceived epidemic of racist police violence against the black community.
Now, don't strawman us. Police reform is a part of what people are protesting about, but Black Lives Matter has always been about a much broader challenge to the bias in our criminal justice system.
92 people were shot and 27 killed in Chicago alone, right? One city. This is almost entirely a story of black men killing members of their own community.
So this is the very classic misdirection conservatives tend to engage in when it comes to talking about systemic racism. You say it was a problem when such and such white police officer shot such and such black 12-year-old, but did you know 100 people died in Chicago last year? I rest my case, as they fold their arms atop one another. Well, there's a problem with that. Let me ask you guys something. When you commit sanctions against another country that leads them into starvation and degenerates their society and their civic order, who actually commits the crime amidst the population of the people who are being sanctioned? Really think about it. If there's some small island country of 500,000 people, and we sanction them, we keep them from getting the food, the medical supplies they need, and then those people in that 500,000 population island nation, well, in the absence of social order caused by material abundance, people start to hurt one another. People start to hoard food and medical supplies. People fight over them. It's a historical reality that an absence of food and medicine very frequently leads to civil unrest in the communities that are being sanctioned. But who's actually doing the hurt? Now, if you just look at crime statistics, oh, well, who's hurting over there? Well, it's island nation resident hurting island nation resident. Murders and rapes and robberies being committed against island nation residents by island nation residents. But who's causing the hurt? It'd be us. Because by sanctioning them, we caused the material and social conditions which led to that increased rate of intra-community violence. And that is what we have done to black communities in this country. We have sanctioned them. We have denied them good housing. We have denied them good education. We have denied them good social services. We have denied them good infrastructure. We have denied them good business opportunities. We have denied them the same level of economic mobility afforded to other groups in this country. In many cases, we have denied them loans. We have denied them access to tutors and social work and other policies designed to elevate people's status in society. We have denied them a normal rate of policing. We have denied them fair and just treatment by the criminal justice system. We have denied them equal rates of sentencing when you account for all other forms of possible variable countenance. We have denied them, in essence, to the same extent, every single component of what our civil society relies on. They even have food deserts in some of these communities. Got to drive a long while before you find a proper grocery store, but there's a 7-Eleven on every block. That's why obesity is so common in poor neighborhoods. It's because it's hard to get the money for a good, proper meal when a McDouble is $2 or however much. I don't eat at McDonald's. And it's hard to find the time to cook a healthy meal when you have to work 3 jobs to pay your rent. And it remains a fact that in the presence of these conditions, those people will commit crime against one another. That if we do that to a community, and that is largely the black community we have done this to, that the members of those communities will engage in disproportionate rates of criminality, everything from rape to murder to thievery to larceny to grand theft auto. But we are not levying blame at individuals who are acting in ways which circumstantially correspond to the environments they have been placed in. We are looking to address systemically the causes for this disproportionate behavior, which is why I say now, and I say this to Sam Harris and anyone who likes Sam Harris, that the rate of black murders committed by the police and the rate of black murders committed by black people are utterly irrelevant when compared against one another, because the rate of black on black crime is a product of the system these protests are attempting to address. It's not about blame. It's not about hurting the white man, because it would, by all accounts, benefit our country economically to address these impoverished areas. It is about recognizing the fact that people behave predictably when put in predictable circumstances, and the predictable circumstances the majority of the black people in this country live in are predictably worse and lead to predictably worse outcomes than those of the average white person, and there are things that we can do to address these disproportionate outcomes civically, and what's more, a large number of these disproportionate outcomes are the product either of implicit bias, which exists today, or of lingering bias from more evidently racist time periods. And I have spoken for a long time on this segment, so let's give him a chance to respond.
And this type of violence is far more representative of the kind of violence the black community needs to worry about. And ironically, it's clear that one remedy for this violence would be effective policing. Now, these are simply the
Effective policing and martial policing are not the same things. If you want to ask a criminologist, they will not tell you that militarized police using militarized policing methods decreases crime in a neighborhood. In fact, if we were to look at the data and to rely on facts rather than feelings, we would come to the conclusion that police militarization does not lead to a decrease in crimes committed or officer injuries and may actually increase both, because you cannot fix deep-seated socioeconomic problems by arresting the occasional person you see behaving criminally.
facts of crime in our society as best we understand them. And the police have to figure out how to respond to these facts professionally and ethically. And the question is, are they doing that? And obviously there's considerable doubt that they're doing that professionally and ethically. But Roland Fryer, the Harvard economist whose work I once discussed with Glenn Lowry on the podcast, he studied police encounters involving black and white suspects and the use of force. His paper is titled, and this is from 2016, An Empirical Analysis of Racial Differences in Police Use of Force. And Fryer is black, and he went into this research with the expectation that the data would confirm that there's an epidemic of lethal police violence directed against black men, especially.
But you will not find that data, which is why, and I've made this argument many times, it's actually not a very good idea for us to focus on police brutality as the focal point for our protests, because it is true that black people do commit far more violent crime than white people, proportional to their makeup of the population. And for that reason, any deviation in police brutality and police response tactics can in large part be explained by that existing disparity. Now, there is evidence that police officers who can be assigned behavioral traits which lead to the dehumanization of black people are more likely to commit violence against those black people. But the simple, narrow lens of police shootings alone is not the hill we want to die on when it comes to racism. Not when we have all that other evidence available to us.
But he didn't find that. However, he did find support for the idea that black people suffer more non-lethal violence at the hands of cops.
That would be true.
Than whites do. So let's look at this. The study examined data from 10 major police departments in Texas, Florida, and California. Generally, Fryer found that there's a 25% greater likelihood that the police would go hands-on black suspects than white ones, cuffing them or forcing them to the ground or using other non-lethal force. Specifically in New York City, in encounters where black and white citizens were matched for other characteristics, they found that cops were 17% more likely to go hands-on black suspects, 18% more likely to push them into a wall, 16% more likely to put them in handcuffs in a situation where they weren't being arrested, 18% more likely to push them to the ground, 25% more likely to use pepper spray or a baton.
I will give Sam Harris credit for one thing, if nothing else. He is the perfect cadence and vocal tone for a pseudo-intellectual. Whether or not you actually believe him to be a pseudo-intellectual, it is very easy to drift off listening to his voice and imagine that he is speaking with a honeyed tongue every truth you were never before told. He does have a very nice voice.
19% more likely to draw their guns, and 24% more likely to point a gun at them. So this is more or less the full continuum of violence, short of using lethal force. And it seems, based on the data we have, that blacks receive more of it than whites. So what accounts for this disparity? Racism? Maybe. However, as I said, it's inconvenient to note from other data that suggests that black cops and Hispanic cops are more likely to shoot black and Hispanic suspects.
No, it doesn't. I've seen that argument made before. Well, actually, black and Hispanic cops are more likely to use lethal force against black folk. No shit. Neighborhoods with a lot of black folk are going to have more black police. That's just a matter of proximity. I mean, yeah. If you go, I mean, in a lot of those neighborhoods, I mean, where you have a lot of black on black crime, a lot of gang violence, very often these neighborhoods are patrolled by black police officers or Hispanic police officers, who, as we know, are one half black socioeconomically. Because it's a lot easier to work through the ins and outs of a neighborhood if there's a sense of camaraderie with the people that you're policing. Now, that's not always the case, obviously. And if I remember correctly, there is evidence suggesting that police tend to behave better and people have less complaints about the police if people are being policed by people of their own race. But that happens more often when black people are the recipients of the policing than with white people, i.e., black people are more comfortable being policed by black people proportionally than white people are being comfortable policed by white people, as in black people mind the racial deviation more. And it makes sense. If you're a black person and you experience over-policing, you probably live in a pretty bad neighborhood, just statistically speaking. And in such a neighborhood, I think it's important for a lot of these these impoverished people, these underserved people, to believe that there is a cultural through line to the people who are policing them. I would make the argument it's less about race and about the knowledge that the person you are being policed by might have come from the neighborhood that you're in. And that won't matter as much to white people, because if you're a white person in a largely white neighborhood, you're more likely to be doing okay socioeconomically, and a black person rolling through isn't going to make you worry, oh my god, that guy's not from the hood, he's probably going to treat me like shit. That tends not to be an experience white people have. I think what often goes unspoken of in our when we talk about police violence against black people, I think what's most terrifying isn't the actual violence, but the terror of occupation. Black people feel much less at ease around police officers than white people do, and conservatives will attribute this to black people having a culture of victimhood. But if you hear black people talk about their experiences being policed, it sounds like they are literally by being occupied by a fucking foreign army. Like they're French people after Nazis took over France. Like they're living their lives, but they know like at any moment, you know? God, I mean, I have so many stories just from the black friends that I had in high school. I remember the funniest one for me, I think, wasn't even of me. It was from my brother. My brother would go on walks all the time at night because he was just a generally athletic guy, and Los Angeles has, you know, a really nice, generally nice weather, and he would go walk and have a good time. And one day he was walking with a black friend, just because they were hanging out. He must have been like 13, 14 or something. They got stopped by police 3 times during that less than an hour-long walk. It was the only time my brother had ever been stopped by the police while walking. Can you imagine? Now, obviously, none of those police officers rolled up and said, uh-oh, there's a black person here, time for us to do some policing. But you get the point. You get the gist. And that sense of perpetual occupation is, I think, probably the most damaging thing overall to the black community or to individuals in the black community. There's been research done on how being subjected to that kind of experience can damage the mental health of people subjected to it. Like it's tantamount to trauma. I mean, you're being occupied, you know? You are living under the arm of a repressive state. The agents of the state are comfortable engaging in trivial but flagrant acts of bias against you and people who look like you. But because that comes down to perception, it's very easy for conservatives to ignore that argument.
Than white cops are. I'm not sure how an ambient level of racism explains that. Are there
That was a very dumb thing he just said.
more likely to shoot black and Hispanic suspects than white cops are? I'm not sure how an ambient level of racism explains that.
So he is suggesting that a bias against black and Hispanic people, when accounting for all other factors, can't be racism because black and Hispanic people are more likely to be present to shoot black people. That is a very dumb argument for several reasons. First of all, as I said, proximity is a factor. Black and Hispanic cops are more likely to be policing black and Hispanic people proportionally. And second of all, it is entirely possible for black and Hispanic people to carry subliminal biases against black and Hispanic people. That is a thing.
Are there other explanations? Well, again, it could be that blacks are less cooperative with the police. And if so, this would be worth understanding. A culture of resisting arrest would be a very bad thing to cultivate, given that the only response to such resistance is for the police to increase their use of force.
Now, this is what happens every single time I talk with somebody like Sam Harris or a conservative-leaning person. You have data that indicates overwhelmingly that there is a racial bias, even when accounting for other factors, and then the person, for no particular reason, will wave their hand and say, well, racism can't be the answer. In the case of Sam Harris, the reason he waved his hand was because black people and Hispanic people are more likely to be policed by black and Hispanic people, and thus more likely to be shot by them. Which is a nonsensical reason to dismiss the possibility of racial bias. But then, now lacking an explanation for that bias, Sam Harris invents a new one. The idea that black people are so much more non-compliant with police. A factor which is so substantial that it accounts for a discrepancy which is statistically significant, but so hidden that it wasn't accounted for by the researchers, and that is what explains the bias. This is the flagrant anti-intellectualism that I have come to know in arguing about systemic bias, because it is impossible for a multivariate reductive analysis to account for every conceivable correlating factor. It's not possible. Conservatives will dismiss that fact as evidence that actually there is no racial bias, and it's this other factor they failed to account for. I think I'm comfortable from the section of this podcast that I've listened to in understanding Sam Harris's approach. In essence, he is very comfortable invoking the black rate of criminality without providing any explanation, which gives his audience, varied in opinion as they may be, a wide variety of possible interpretations, ranging from the environmental to the genetic. He will dismiss evidence which does not favor his point with a frankly unbecoming of his level of education dismissal. Seriously, because black and brown police are more likely to shoot black and brown people. That's it. That's your excuse. With an embarrassing level of anti-intellectualism. And then he will assign to these studies a correlative data point, which was not backed by the researchers, which actually once more places the blame on black people. Because that is what people like Sam Harris want to do. They want to look at all these protesting black people, all these rioters, all these looters, all these protesters, and he wants to point at them, and he wants to say, okay, how about you fix your own problems first? You're really going to bother us white people when you commit so much crime amongst yourself? But as we have to remember from the embargo analogy, just because the actual criminalities being committed within a community does not mean that the causes for that criminality may not be committed by a larger systemic institution or a systemic cause. In the case of the embargo analogy, it is the embargo. And in the case of black people in America, it is institutional racism. I do not know if Sam Harris is racist, though his defense of Charles Murray, who is undeniably a racist, is rather suspect. But I do know that his narrative here is one which perfectly suits the mentality of the American racist. One who is willing to dismiss all forms of systemic bias as non-existent, one who is willing to assign all of the crimes committed by and all of the pain suffered by black people in this country as being a product of their own faults, one who will dismiss academic research when it does not favor their point, but then sneakily edit the abstract of that data to better suit whatever conclusion it is he is trying to push. I have never had a particularly high opinion of Sam Harris ever since his frankly embarrassing assertion that he has solved the is-ought gap in philosophy, which is a preposterous statement, and his general unwillingness to engage with the academic perspective of an issue seems to be following through now. Oh, did you guys not know that? He literally said that he had solved the is-ought gap, that he can use science to determine morality. And then he does this by vaguely gesturing at, like, the worst of all possible hells. And if we agree people don't want to go to hell, then we can agree that science determines morality. It's actually, I don't have the education or the background to debunk it as thoroughly as it deserves to be debunked. But if you want to go over it, it was genuinely insane, and he has been made fun of very broadly for his perspective. Yeah, well, we can all agree that nobody likes touching a hot stove. Therefore, touching a hot stove or forcing someone to touch a hot stove is fundamentally immoral. You know, it like that, like it's like that level of stuff, basically. Anyway, that's about all I have to say about this. It doesn't surprise me that this got super popular because it's every lazy, from the small segment that I've listened to, I have to clarify, it's every lazy, ad hoc, biased dismissal of the overwhelming evidence in favor of systemic racism in favor of an explanation which is at once non-explanatory and also very deeply suggestive of a biological problem with black people. They're rather fond of that, aren't they? I don't think I've argued with a conservative once who wasn't willing to at least suggest or imply a genetic explanation for black criminality. They're very fond of that. They very often will not own up to it directly. If you suggest sociological after sociological after sociological explanation, they'll dismiss all of those, and you'll ask them, well, what causes it? And they'll say, well, it's their culture. And you'll ask, okay, why is their culture the way it is? And they'll go, I don't know. Why is their culture the way it is? And without falling back on sociological explanations for that question, the only remaining answer is one which they know they can't substantiate in academia, so they do not directly state: the genetic explanation. Roland Fryer is wrong. There is racial bias in shootings by police. Interesting. This is a harvard.edu paper published in 2016. I have not seen this. Is this a response to a data point that I was familiar with? Breaking down the analysis of police shootings in Houston, which I supplemented with census data, found that black people were over 5 times as likely to be shot relatives to whites. Latinos were roughly twice as likely to be shot. Fryer was not comparing rates of police shootings by race, however. Instead, his research asked whether these racial differences were the result of racial bias rather than merely statistical discrimination. Both terms have specific meanings in economics. Okay, so the difference here is whether or not you're accounting for other correlative factors and whether or not you're accounting for disproportionate bias. Interesting. Well, that would only favor my point, if that's the case, but I'll have to look over that later. That's a lot for me to read off the cuff on stream. Anyway, I don't want to appear as uncharitable to Sam Harris as I may have come off here. You have to understand, I have argued with a lot of people who talk about black criminality and a lot of people who dismiss the existence of racial bias in the criminal justice system. And I find they fall into a collection of intellectual pitfalls so consistently that I believe it might be motivated by bias. I say believe here a little bit, maybe sarcastically. Pretty soon I'm going to be debating two neo-Nazis, Eric Stryker and James Alsop, alongside Destiny, on the existence of systemic bias in the criminal justice system in America. And I know that they will be making essentially the same arguments here as Sam Harris. The difference is, though, in all likelihood, they'll eventually resort to talking about the Jews, the warrior gene, but the initial set of arguments will be very similar.